So that was the atmosphere that we grew up in. We grew up knowing about the war, listening to the stories, and being told that we hope it never happens again.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends of Faces of Armenia, we warmly welcome you to another special series on Artsakh. And our distinguished guest today, Lilit Arzumanian, is actually a resident of Artsakh, born and lived there. But before we get started, a quick note to the format. Our special series on Artsakh offers experts from a broad spectrum of disciplines a platform to share their perspectives and reflect on Nagorno-Karabakh. By elevating their perspectives, we hope to add to the substance of ongoing discussions, strengthening mediating forces, both of which advance an unmistakable impetus to find and define an agreeable, timely, and hopefully lasting end to the war. We, Faces of Armenia, see ourselves as a bridge between Armenia and the international community, calling and enabling productive relationships and positive engagement. But without further ado, Lilit, I think it's time to turn to you. If you could
Yes.
introduce yourself, drop a word or two to your background, to your person, to your personality.
Yes, sure. Hi, nice to meet you. I'm Lilit Arzumanian. I was born and grew up in Artsakh. I went to school there, but since I was going to the medical school, we don't have it in Artsakh. So I was studying in Yerevan for the past 8 years. Now I'm an ophthalmology resident, and this is my last year. So we'll see what we're going to do after that.
Wow, that's quite an experience. Congratulations on your last year.
Yeah, thank you.
But maybe let's go a little bit back in time. Can you maybe describe one of the first few cognizant experiences of Artsakh? What was your first memories of Artsakh that you can?
Well, I think one of the earliest memories that I have should be around 2 or 3 years old. So we were living in Hadrut with my grandparents then, because my dad was in the army. So we were living with my mom and my sister, with my grandparents. It was a very fun, very peaceful childhood, surrounded by nature. So we had a great garden. So that was the the earliest memory that I have. Then we moved to Stepanakert. That was still in the army. So I went to school in Stepanakert. I went to the technical school. I graduated from a technical school. So that was also I have a lot of memories from that time, naturally. Of course, we grew up knowing that we were children that were born after a war, like shortly after a war. I was there when the consequences of the war were still fought against. We were still rebuilding the country, rebuilding the cities. I still remember, when I was really young, the Khazanchesot church that was bombed recently. I remember it being rebuilt. Yeah, that's a big contrast when you grew up seeing how the consequences of the war are being swept away. And then when you are not expecting it to be that devastating again, and the war hits again, and you see the catastrophe, all of the consequences, you see how how villages, cities are being bombed, how a lot of people are suffering. Yeah, sure.
And so I'm really interested. Can you tell us about the mood, the atmosphere of rebuilding the country in the early 90s? How did it look like? How fast did it come about?
Yeah, sure. The people were working hard. It was an atmosphere of an uprising. A lot of people came back after the war, so the population was also rising. The living conditions were getting better. The schools were being rebuilt. The churches, the cities, the roads. Um, so yeah, that would be basically it here. It was very uplifting. It was very positive. We grew up listening to the stories of the war, thinking that we will never encounter it ourselves. So a big part of our education was the Artsakh war. We always had every year, like veterans visiting, talking about the war, telling the stories. Um, our teachers also, they were part of the war. They would tell about their experience. So we grew up listening about war and seeing, feeling the contrast of the times that were then and the peaceful time that we grew up in.
So, can you help our audience who may not know much about war of how did these tales sound like? What did your teacher share? What did
Yeah, sure. The teachers that were female, they will tell about how they were baking bread under the bombings. They will tell that in the beginning how they were scared, how hard it was, and how with time they started to ignore it. They saw it at a new normal, and every time whenever they had electricity, whenever they had the chance, they would go up back home, bake bread for themselves, for the soldiers. Um, how back then we didn't have much internet, we didn't have news. How they would ask each other, they ask the neighbors if they knew something, if how their husbands, how their sons were doing. And the teachers that were male, they will tell about the war, how they were fighting, the strategies, how they will, for example, our physics and math teachers, they both had helped with like counting how to hit the helicopters. They will tell about those. Whenever we will be in the physics class, we will be studying how the rockets are flying, and they will tell us about, like, back in the day during the war, we used these formulas to count how to hit a helicopter. So that was epic. The interesting part is that when people talk about war, they don't talk about it like it was something sad or something to grieve about, because they didn't have the time for that. It was their way of living, so to say. So it's very interesting how quickly people get used to the new normal and they find a way to live no matter what.
So could you maybe like dwell on this a little bit? How was your personal subjective awareness of war growing up, hearing all these tales around you?
Well, yeah, I was a child, so I wasn't understanding much, but I would hear at home, for example, all the time my mom would be asking if there will be a new war, and that will be like, okay, it won't happen because of this or that in the school. So whenever we studied war, we'll be talking about war, and the children will ask the teachers, like, how was it back then? And they will say, well, although we survived, we really wish that you don't have to see it yourselves, that you won't be encountered by war. So that was mainly the focus. We will talk about it like something in the past and something we hope never happens again. So that was the atmosphere that we grew up in. We grew up knowing about the war, listening to the stories, and being told that we hope it never happens again.
And how did this like educational war experience reflect on the positive sides of Artsakh? Was there a general feeling of, yes, we are rebuilding, we are going to prosperity, we are being together, we won this war, and now there's a better future? But can you reflect?
Yes, sure. And the confidence that if it were to happen again, there is no way we are not going to win again. So we went through that. That was an useful experience. We are going to use that and win again if it's needed. So our boys grew up knowing that they will be soldiers, that they will be fighting. They knew that it was inevitable. They will go and fight. So
very, very interesting. can you say there was really, yes, fight and win, or
Yeah.
no, I don't want war. War will not happen. Like, do you think both of these were these
I think
perspectives?
the mixture of both. Like we hoped the war will not happen, but we knew that sooner or later it could happen again. So we have to be prepared. We have to be ready. Like that. Yeah.
And so, how did then? I know Artsakh is a very picturesque place in a global context.
Yeah, it's very
How
beautiful.
did the beautiful nature influence you growing up, and did it serve a good positive counterbalance?
Yeah, of course. Like I grew up among mountains in the surrounded by mountains, surrounded by forests. So I've never really noticed it that it makes me more comfortable when I'm in the mountains, in the forest, than when I'm at the seashore, for example, where you can't see anything for miles away. So I think when I grew up in this little cocoon of mountains, it really changes your perspective and what you find comfortable when it comes to nature, what you find more natural, so to say. So when I see a plain with no trees, like the deserts, or when I see like long roads without any mountains surrounding it, I'm like, something is wrong. So I really feel more comfortable when I'm surrounded by trees, surrounded by nature.
So that really brings us to, can you please try to lead a person who has never been to Artsakh through the landscape of Artsakh? What would you find if you walk through Artsakh?
Yeah, you will find a lot of greenery. Like, for example, even compared to Armenia, Artsakh is much more greener. Although the weather and the climate is not that different, it's much more greener. It's you walk into the deep forest surrounded by old trees, and usually when in Armenia, what is interesting that churches are often built in the mountains. So you will be walking around, for example, around Gandzasar. You will be walking around in the forest. You don't see anything. You only see mountains. And then suddenly, when you're getting nearer, you see a church that is perfectly integrated into the nature. So you see how what was man-built, built by the man, and what was created by nature, like perfectly in a harmony together. So the birds chirping, the wind blowing, and then you see something that was man-made, that was so old, that has been here for centuries, and how perfectly well it works together.
So that is so interesting. Is it really the Artsakhian lifestyle and a way of thinking to build something so integrated, or does religion play a huge role in that?
I think it's a feature of Armenian architecture. When we build buildings, when we build churches, we build them so they don't stand out from the nature. They are part of the nature. It comes, I think, to the Armenian philosophy of beauty. And when even historically, no matter what, through history, we have been always building cities, castles, churches that are well integrated into the nature, so you can spot them right away. They are so well integrated.
Wow.
Yeah.
Maybe could you tell us about how many historic and ancient structures there are in Artsakh?
I don't think I can give you the precise number, but we have studied that in history back in school, but I don't remember the exact number.
But so
there's a lot.
Quite a few.
Yeah, there's a lot. Really, there's a lot.
And so in the international media, unfortunately, Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh is always titled or portrayed as the separatist region. But can you please help us understand what is Artsakh? Like, how many cities are there in Artsakh? How many people live in the capital? And in what ways does it assimilate just another European country? And in what ways is Artsakh unique?
I think the separatist part comes entirely from the enemy side, because we have been living here for thousands of years. Armenia, Artsakh was the part of historical Armenia from the beginning. We have cities from the times of before Christ that have been excavated now because the works have been stopped now, understandably. But when they say separatists, they mean from their perspective. But when we look from our perspective, we are living in our native land. That's the part of Armenia, historical Armenia. So for us, we are just fighting against an enemy that tries to take part of it for itself, for themselves, by claiming it as theirs. Although it's, when we look at it historically, it's a country that's so much younger, so they really can't have any claims for the lands that belong to another nation for centuries, for thousands of years, and they come and say they're separatists, they want to take a part from our land for themselves. So
that makes me wonder, can you describe, I think that is so important, the connection of Artsakhians to their land, like really on an emotional lens of analysis?
Yeah, well, for like me, myself, my ancestors, great ancestors, they all were mostly from Artsakh. I think my grandparents' side have some Western Armenian blood, but mostly we're from Artsakh. So we have a deep connection, because when you know that your ancestors lived in the same place that you do now, creates a different kind of bond. It's not the country just like you grew up in, it's the country where your ancestors lived, where they lived, created, and where your parents also grew up in, your grandparents, their grandparents. When the same people from the same family for generations have been living on the same plot of land, it's not just a territory anymore, it's much more deeper connection. I don't think there is much of a difference, but since we have our own dialect and we were mostly separated from Armenia because we had our semi-independence, and we were like a little fortress, mountainous fortress, we think a little bit differently sometimes when it comes to certain topics.